Good morning, everyone, and Sairam. So, again, I welcome you all with one more session of History chapter, the French Revolution, Part 4. Basically, Part 4, this is the last part of this chapter. So, let's start today's session. But before moving further, let's take a quick recap what topic we have discussed in Part 3rd. Now just tell me students, do you remember what topic we have discussed in part 3rd? Basically in part 3rd we discussed how does France abolish monarchy in France and establish republic, right? Second we discussed the region of terror, basically the period from 1793 to 1794 referred as the region of terror, as Maximilian Robespierre raised his power within the National Convention as the leader of Jacobin Club. He was the leader of Jacobin Club. Then at last we discussed a directory rule in France. Basically, after the fall of Jacobin's government or republic in France, that led the opportunity to the wealthier section of the society to seize all the power again. But the political instability of Directory paved the way or gave the chance to rise military dictator in France, or we can say the rise to the power of Napoleon Bonaparte. Okay, now let's see the topic that which we will cover in this video. First, we discussed about rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, rise the power of Napoleon Bonaparte in France. Then we will discuss the French Revolution brought many changes in French society. Women revolution, the abolition of slavery, and at last the revolution and everyday life. So move on to the next, that means move on to the first topic, rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. Okay, first we understand who was Napoleon Bonaparte. So, Napoleon Bonaparte was the French military leader. Who was he? French military leader and first emperor of France, right? He was the French military leader and first emperor of France who conquered much of the neighboring European countries. Napoleon Bonaparte was also known as Napoleon I. He was born on the island of Corsica. Napoleon Bonaparte rapidly rose his power in France through the ranks of the military during the French Revolution, that means from 1789 to 1799. Okay, now let's understand how he rise his power in France. Rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. So as I said, the political instability of Directory that gave the rise of the military dictator in France. So Napoleon Bonaparte in 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte, he just crowned himself as the Emperor of France. When he was crowned himself as the Emperor of France in 1804, right? Just note down this point. He just conquered many of the neighboring European countries and placed member of his family on the crown. Basically, Napoleon Bonaparte, he just saw himself as the modernizer of Europe. He introduced many laws over them, such as the protection of the private property, and the most important is the uniform system of weight and measures provided by the decimal system. Second thing is basically Napoleon Bonaparte was seen as the liberators who would bring freedom for all the people. But very soon, Napoleonic armies came to be viewed everywhere as an invading force. Why? Because Napoleon Bonaparte, he just conquered, he annexed much of the neighboring European country. That's why very soon Napoleonic armies came to be viewed everywhere as an invading forces. But finally, he was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, right? He was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Now, first of all, Battle of Waterloo, when and where this battle was fought. So this battle was fought in Belgium. Where? This battle was fought in Belgium on 18th June in 18th June 1815, right? Just note down this point also. This battle of Waterloo, basically this battle is very important because this battle marked the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. So this battle fought in Belgium on 18th June 1850. So through the series of events, Napoleon Bonaparte, he expanded his region across Western and Central Europe. And basically the Battle of Waterloo, this battle was fought between Napoleonic armies and the Duke of Wellington, right? Okay. Now, the French Revolution and society. The French Revolution had far-reaching effect on the society at large. Basically, the revolution brought many changes in French society. Right? Okay, so let's read the changes or the social reforms brought by the French Revolution in French society. So the first topic is women revolution. Okay, now the question is, did women have a revolution? Yes. From the very beginning, women were very active participant in revolution. Basically, their participation in revolution brought many changes in the French society. Actually, they participated in this revolution. They hoped that their involvement in this revolution pressurized the revolutionary government to take some major steps to improve the life of the women. Because at that time in France, the women in French society, they faced inequalities, right? Why? They just hope that because at that time the women in French society, they faced inequalities. Okay, like for example, like most women of third estate, they had work for living in the houses of the prosperous families or people. They did not get the equal pay. Basically, their wages were very less as compared to the men. Most women did not have access to education or job training. Basically, at that time, only the daughters of nobles and the members of the wealthier society, they only study on convent. Even their marriages were also arranged. So during at that time, as I said, like the women's, they were very active participants in revolutions. So there were many women political clubs were formed over there. So to discuss and voice their interest, women started their own political clubs and newspaper, and sorry almost 60 almost 60 women's clubs came up in the French society at that time. And the most famous among them was that Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women. Right? Society of Revolutionary and the Republican Women. But women were very disappointed. Why they were disappointed? Because at that time the new constitution of France, which was completed in 1791, declared them as passive citizens. Basically, according to new constitution of France, they denied the right to vote. right? The new Constitution of France the new Constitution of France 1791 denied the right to vote, and women's they demanded that right to vote and to be elected in the assembly, and they also demanded to hold political office. So the revolutionary government they just passed laws to improve the condition of women in France. Now let's read the laws passed by the revolutionary government to improve the condition of women in France. First, by the creation of a state school. Basically, now after that, schooling was made compulsory for all the girls, right? Second law, now their father could no longer force them to marriage against their will. Marriages was made into a contract entered into freely and registered under the civil law. Now divorce was made legal, even could applied by the both women and the men. Last, women could now train for jobs, could become artists, or they run their own small businesses. But during the time, if we talk about the but during the region of terror, that means during the Jacobin government order laws, closure of all the women's club in France. Even their political activities they also banned. Even many of the prominent women of the to the women clubs, they were arrested. They were also executed. But their women movements for right to vote and equal wages continued through the next 200 years in most countries of the world. Even an international suffrage movement, international suffrage movement in the late 19th century and 20th century was initiated in this activity. So finally in 1946 that women in France they won the right to vote. In 1946 the French women finally they just got the writing votes. Now the next is second topic, the abolition of slavery. Basically one of the most important social reform of Jacobin region, right? One of the most important social reform of the Jacobin region was that the abolition of slavery system in France. In France, slave trade was begun in 17th century, right? Slave trade began in France in 17th century. Now the reason of this trade. First of all, the colonies in the Caribbean, which were the suppliers of the commodities such as the tobacco, indigo, sugar and the coffee. So the Europeans they were unwilling to go and work in the distant and unfamiliar land. So this create a shortage of labor in plantation. So to fulfill this shortage, French merchants they sailed from the port of Bordeaux to the African coast, and they bought slaves from the local chieftain. Now, thus the slave trade, as I said, began in 17th century in France, and there was a triangular slave trade between the Europe, Africa, and America. Now, in the 18th century, there was a little criticism of slavery in France, but no laws were passed against it. Even the National Assembly of France just held a debate against the right of the men should be expanded to all. But finally, in 1794, right, In 1794, the convention made free all the slaves, right? In 1794, first slavery abolished in France, but 10 years later, this system again reintroduced by the Napoleon Bonaparte. Just remember, just note down this point. First, in 1794, that the convention made free all the slaves. That means this was abolished in France. But again, after the 10 years later, this was reintroduced by the Napoleon Bonaparte. Then again, it was finally in 1848, slavery was abolished in French colonies, right? But finally, 1848, that the slavery was abolished in French colonies. The year after, 1789, brought many changes in the lives of men, women, and children. Like how? First, the revolutionary government passed law that translated the ideals of liberty and justice into the everyday practice. Second thing is, one of the important law came into effect after the storming of Bastille Fort in the summer of 1789 was that the abolition of censorship in France. Now, third thing is the Declaration of Rights of Men and Citizens proclaimed that freedom of speech and expression now as a natural rights. Next, now third, freedom of press was also mean that opposing views of events could be expressed. Next, newspaper, pamphlets, books and printed pictures flooded the towns of the France, from where they traveled rapidly into the countryside. Discussed the events and changes taking place in the France. Plays, songs and festive processions attracted large number of people, which was one way they could grasp and identify with ideas such as liberty and justice. Basically, the idea of liberty and democratic rights. The idea of liberty and democratic rights was the legacy of French Revolution. Even in India at that time, many of the revolutionary strugglers like the Tipu Sultan, Raja Ram Mohan Rai, they adopted the idea of liberty and democratic rights. Basically, Tipu Sultan and Raja Ram Mohan Rai, they responding the idea like that coming from the revolutionary France. So this is all about your chapter. Here your chapter first, the French Revolution completed. Okay, now let's move on to the timeline of revolution, important date and events. So first, 1774. Louis XVI became the king of France. In 1774, Louis XVI, he was the ruler of France during the French Revolution. So in 1774, he became the king of the France. When he became the king, he faced empty treasury and growing discontent within the society of the old regime. Next, 1789, convocation of State General. Third state form National Assembly. Second, Bastille gets stormed. Even peasants revolt in the countryside. Then in 1791, a constitution is framed for France, and according to this constitution, actually new constitution, the motive of this constitution was that to limit the power of king. Then 1792-93, France becomes republic. The king is beheaded. Overthrow of the Jacobin Republic and a directory rule of France. Then 1804, Napoleon becomes the Emperor of France and annexes large part of Europe. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned himself as the Emperor of France. Then 1850, Napoleon defeated at Waterloo, right? Basically, Battle of Waterloo marked as the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte, and this Battle of Waterloo was fought on 18 June in 1850 in Belgium. Then 1848, end of slavery in France, right? Okay, now what you have to do, you have to first note down important date, line and events in your fair notebook, and you have to prepare notes with the help of this video. Okay, now thank you and have a nice day.